So as I mentioned before, this is a really carefully scripted time because we're getting lots of information. It's really exciting, and we want to make sure we do it all before lunch. Okay, so as you're coming in, just move to the front. Anybody who's giving an Ignite talk should sit up here at this table if you're not there already. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is the Collective Action for Peace, Part 1, setting the stage for mobilization. And what we're trying to give you a sense of in this panel is where are we as a field? Where do we need louder voices? How do we build a public constituency? And we wanted to start with a public opinion poll that Conciliation Resources, based in the UK, envisioned to be given simultaneously in the US, the UK, and Germany to measure public interest and knowledge about and support for peace building and negotiating with armed groups. And we were so excited by the results and the ammunition, for lack of a better word, this gives us for our cause, that we wanted to have Teresa Dumasy from Conciliation Resources and Chip Hauss, who led the US data analysis and policy, to give you the headlines of the survey. So Teresa, welcome.
Thank you, Melanie. So we conducted this research in June and July of this year across UK, US and Germany. We were commissioned by CR in UK and US, in Germany, and Alliance for Peacebuilding ran it in the US. And it was run by the polling company Populous, which is an established national polling company based in the UK. In total, 4,307 adults were polled in an online survey. 2,200 roughly in the UK and 1,000 roughly in each US and Germany. And we had two lines of questioning, really. One was the public understanding of and support for peace building, and secondly, the attitudes towards dialogue with armed groups to further peace. And we've published two reports, which we have brought along today, one with an introduction for a US audience and one with an introduction for a UK audience. So there are four main findings, really, although there's more richness in the data, I would say. But the first is that there's strong public support for greater investment in peace building, and the public actually know what peace building is. Secondly, that the public are supportive and optimistic about international organisations like the UN and their own governments engaging with armed groups and proscribed terrorist organisations to further peace. So to go into those a little bit more detail, to test levels of public support, people responded to the following statement. Peace building plays a vital role in ending violent conflicts around the world. In the US, UK and Germany, we should be investing more resources in this. And in UK and Germany, they responded to those two statements separately. And we saw that in the UK, 60% were in favour of further investment, and in Germany, 70% in favour of further investment. And in the US, they responded to both statements. They was 74% in favour. And Chip will talk a little bit about how there was actually cross-party support for this agenda. Just to test whether people were not just agreeing with peace and love in general, we next presented them with a set of 8 possible descriptions of peace building and asked them to select the 3 statements which best describe peace building. And there was a confidence check after their answers, so they could say the level of confidence with which they were answering the questions. And actually, their answers confounded our sense that peace building is rather too nuanced a term for people to relate to, because we also tested the term conflict resolution, and the findings were pretty similar. So the 3 top statements are what we think practitioners would probably agree as the key principles and tenets of peace building. One is that it's a long-term process of rebuilding relationships, changing attitudes and establishing fairer institutions. Secondly, that it involves everyone from communities to governments working to end fighting and prevent the recurrence of violence. And thirdly, that it involves understanding and addressing the underlying drivers of conflict, not its symptoms. And we actually increased the sample size in Northern Ireland because we thought it would be interesting to see what a population thinks about peace building when they've actually lived through conflict. And the findings in the report show you that there's an even greater level of understanding in Northern Ireland for these descriptions. Then we said, what would people say are the greatest justifications for greater investment in peace building? And they were presented again with a number of different justifications. And what came out highest were the kind of moral arguments, and particularly human rights. Across all three countries, 84% said that human beings have the right to live in peace, free from conflict, as their top justification. Then we come on to those questions about engagement with armed groups. And it got pretty complex at this point because we asked people different nouns. We asked them about talking with, mediating between and negotiating with armed groups. And we also tested different actors, so governments, international organisations like the UN, charities and local communities. But overall, as you can see, there was pretty high level support for international organisations like the UN in particular to talk with, mediate between armed groups. And also pretty high level support for governments to do so. And we then tested what that would look like if we described armed groups as prescribed terrorist organisations. And I have to say we didn't mention ISIS in this, but we did give them a couple of context statements where we said that peace builders play a vital role in mediating peace between armed groups, and we said that prescription can have an impact on, or prescribing an organisation can have an impact on peace-building activity. And the results came out pretty much as high as the questions about armed groups. As you can see on the right-hand side, very high levels of support for international organisations' engagement with prescribed terrorist organisations, and similarly quite high levels of support for governments. I suppose the only slight thing we were hampered with was just using a description of our work as charities, because I don't think there's much level of understanding of what charities do in this field, but we were also tied by the fact that we didn't know whether people would know what an NGO was. So I think we have to think a little bit harder about how people understand kind of the work that organisations do in that field. We also then tested this by asking people, We asked whether people agree that peace processes that engage with armed groups, guerrilla groups or terrorists can help to end violent conflict. And so they had to show their levels of agreement with that statement. And the results show that labels, as you might expect, do matter. So presented with the same statement but swapping in armed groups and terrorists resulted in a 10% drop-off in support. Also interesting to know that in Northern Ireland, 74% agreed with that statement for armed groups and 70% agreed for terrorist organisations. This was in contrast to the UK overall, which is 63% and then 53%, as you can see here. So finally, we asked people how they would feel knowing that their national governments had played a key role in negotiating peace between or with armed groups elsewhere in the world. And we presented them with 8 possible emotions, ranging from strong kind of anti-emotions versus strongly favourable emotions. And the 3 top emotions that came out were hopeful, happy and proud for the UK and the US. And in Germany it was similar, but they had confident as their 3rd highest. Uneasy came out around 15%, but there was also a degree of kind of don't know. I think I'll stop there, but I was just going to say I think the findings show, and we can find them on our websites here, that the public do understand the timescales and the types of effort involved to address the drivers and causes of conflict, and they support it. And I think there's a greater level of public appetite for non-military forms of engagement with armed groups than we expected. I should say that we ran these polls a few weeks after the attacks in London and in Manchester, and I was actually quite nervous about what would come out of them. So it is quite surprising, I think, the results of the survey. We hope they are useful to you in your work as well. I think they raise also questions as well as give you answers as to why people think like this and how can we use the results for our work. Thank you.
I've spent most of my life standing behind podiums and realized that it's not the way I like to work. But I would like to not talk so much about the results themselves, but what they mean for us in the U.S. And, oh, it's not supposed to work this way. There were two surprises for me. I am trained as a pollster at the University of Michigan, which is Mecca for polling. And we have never seen results like this in all of my years of doing public opinion polling. And in fact, I went into this project fearful that we would find that we were an incredibly divided country, that people looked at people like us with hostility. And if you remember Teresa's charts and her bars, they all look pretty much the same. From country, from demographic group, it doesn't matter. And in this country, the two surprises are first the direction, that depending on how you count, give or take 85% of the people we polled thought that the kind of work that we do is important, and they supported it. Good liberal Democrats like myself were a little more willing to support it than others, but most Republicans did as well. I've lost a slide. Okay. And how I wanted to phrase this discussion was around two books that I read last week. The first one is by the three guys on the top, Norm Ornstein, E.J. Dionne, and Tom Mann, who are among the most respected political scientists in the U.S., and this book is called Post-Trump America. And because they're not all lefties, Norm works for the American Enterprise Institute. They have trying to figure out, what does America without Trump, post-Trump, look like? How do we both present our opposition to what is happening, but do it in a way that doesn't drive the people who disagree with us further apart, but in fact creates a space that we as peace builders know, one in which we draw people we disagree with in closer to us. The second book I read was by Chip, and obviously like Chip, Heath and Dan Heath, who are brothers and jointly write business books. And the book they wrote is called The Power of Moment. That there are moments that you can actually help to orchestrate, the way we heard in the first session this morning, where you can help people reach decisions about how to change. And so out of the survey, I have 4 takeaways. The first and second kind of hang together, and that is that we are on foreign policy, peace-related issues, not all that divided. We are more in agreement across age, partisan, demographics, etc. lines. And that flies in the face with what the Pew Center on People and the Press have come up with, which is that we are, in fact, on almost every other issue, incredibly divided. I can give you the reference later. Second, that pair of two is that we as a field, as a movement, need to think about building broader coalitions that are, in my terminology, outward-looking. AFP was set up to help the peace-building field do better work itself. Now I think we're talking about, how do we reach out to the rest of society? How do we, when I worked at Search for Common Ground with Tom, we never even thought about how you go about building grassroots coalitions in the U.S., and we're working on a project to make that happen. And let me give you 5 examples real quickly as takeaways. The first, and 2 you will have a chance to hear about literally this afternoon. The first is the Bridge Alliance with Devlin, who will be speaking this afternoon. There she is. The second is a book called Wedged by Eric Fogg, and his colleague Eric will be here this afternoon, that talks about how we let ourselves become as divided as we are. There are other 3 we can talk about offline. Well, one was a group that I was involved with representing AFP that brought together networks of American peace builders at Point of View at George Mason in June. So Philip was there, Natalie, who was upstairs, you can tell her she's a woman with the shortest hair in the room. A couple of others of us were there. And we're trying to bring together networks of people from different ideological and professional connections. Another one that we can talk about is the Divided Communities Project run by Grand Lum, who Melanie introduced me to a few years ago, who is a product of the Harvard School on Negotiation, and unlike most of us, has gone off into a part of doing this work where he's actually made a fair amount of money, but is a very high-powered lawyer, was the head of the Office of Community Relations under the Obama administration, and is one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. And the third is a project that is being done at Oberlin College, where I went, but will also take place at 4 or 5 other schools, 4 other places, not all schools, called Rethinking the State of American Democracy. And let me bring it back to end with the 2 things I started us with once I got the slide order under control. How do we create a political movement for change in which we, like Norm, Tom, and EJ say, how do we create a movement that says we do not accept what's going on now, but do it in a way that brings people we disagree with closer to us, not further away? And how do we create the moments that the Heaths talk about? And you're about to hear from Peter Woodrow, and Peter and I, when we were 50 years ago this month, helped block a military recruiter's car on the streets of Oberlin, Ohio. And that moment served to change lots of people's lives and is still discussed in the folklore of Oberlin to this day, unfortunately. So the question is, how do we build those moments? And I don't have answers, but I'm here for the rest of the time to talk.
Thank you so much, Chip and Teresa. We simultaneously scheduled Teresa in 2 panels, so she raced out to her other one. But in introducing Peter Woodrow, I want to say just what a great honor it is to have Peter here to reflect on his years in the peacebuilding field. He is officially retiring from the collaborative learning projects and entering a new phase of his own life, but will always be a peace builder. It's been one of my heroes because he has lived his values as a Quaker, as a scholar, as a mediator, and has really done so much for our field to reflect on our learning, reflect on our impact, and to take this unique space somewhere between academia and practice to make sure that we stay with our values, that we have cumulative impact as a field, and really to live the best ideals of peace building. So thank you, Peter, for joining us today.
Great. It's an honor to be asked to give this presentation, although I will admit that I actually lobbied for it. So I did. I went to Melanie and I said, look, I'm going to be shuffling off the stage. Give me a few minutes to give my particular rant as I do that. Let me acknowledge Polly Byers, who's sitting back. Stand up, Polly, who's the CDA Collaborative Learning Project's Executive Director as of Monday. Welcome to Polly. Let me also just say, as a person who normally you would hear me pushing for peace builders to move beyond personal and individual change to social political change, I was surprised and delighted to hear that this day was dedicated to Alissa Wilson, who is also an old friend of mine. Alissa was just graduating from the Fletcher School at Tufts. It must be now 12 or 13 years ago, I can't remember exactly. And she asked me for one of those, informational interviews. So I met with Alissa in Harvard Square. We had lunch or whatever, and she said, well, how do I get into this field? And she was one of those young, enthusiastic graduate students that wanted to figure out how to do it. And I looked at her and I said, well, what experience do you have to build on? And she told me what she'd been doing, all of which was interesting. And I said, get to the field. Get to a conflict zone, I don't care which one, just go out there and experience what it's like to be in that kind of a setting. And next thing I heard, she's in South Sudan, I think working for Mercy Corps, and you never know what kinds of, when you give advice to somebody, what's going to happen. So that was an interesting example of personal connection that made a difference. Let me just say that, how do I advance this? That's the way. So I've had about 30 years of experience in this field, in the peacebuilding field, but I was reflecting partly yesterday when there's a lot of discussion of the nonviolent action field that builds on 20 years of work in the social change community, building nonviolent action campaigns and running them and all of that. And at somewhere I took a slight turn, not 180 degrees, but maybe 25 degrees turn to really work in the peacebuilding field. And so I really feel that connection between the two, and that'll be reflected in some of the comments I have to make today. What I'm going to be talking about today come from two sources. One is the set of case studies that we've been working on for far too long that looked at the cumulative impact of peacebuilding in 16 conflict zones around the world, looking at why things add up or why they don't add up in those settings. And looking at what contribution peacebuilding really makes and what we can, what kinds of conclusions we might have about what we need to be doing more effectively in those settings. More recently, we've been working on this issue of collective impact in peacebuilding, adapting. Some of you may have heard of the FSG model. If you haven't heard of it, don't worry about it, although you can look it up. But we've been working on adapting that model for collective action to the peacebuilding field, changing the language, looking at the possibilities, looking at the challenges that are represented there. And I'll come back to that at the end of what I have to say. So that's what I'm going to be drawing on. I'm going to give you a very quick overview of some of the findings from the reflective, from the cumulative cases, just enough to make you interested in reading the book, and it'll be out sometime in the next 6 to 8 weeks. And there's an unabashed advertisement on your tables that you can look at and see. It'll be a downloadable PDF. It'll probably also be an Amazon self-publishing kind of thing, which we're mostly doing these days from CDA. So in the cumulative cases, first of all, we applied a systems thinking lens to all of the cases to be able to understand not only the nature of the conflict, but then how were the different interventions that were undertaken there intersecting with that conflict system. So that was one of the things we did. So we looked also at two things. One was what kinds of progress was made. And in many cases, it wasn't total peace or some durable solution. It was just some moment of advancement towards peace. And then what were the persistent issues that continued? Even when there was a peace agreement and maybe a new government elected, there were issues that continued to be problematic in those societies. So we looked at those things in each of the cases. And we were able to identify out of that 6 overarching, what we call domains of progress, and found that in most cases it's necessary to make some progress on each of those domains in some way. Doesn't mean it has to be equal progress, but that if certain areas lag way behind others, that may become an impediment to peace processes. Some of these categories will look familiar to you. Some of the interesting stuff is in the details of how we framed this and the way we saw the issues come about, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So the 6 domains of progress were, not surprisingly, the security and a sense of security. One that came out late, which was sort of implicit in all that we looked at, but wasn't an obvious issue that was out in front, and that was that there needs to be some acknowledgement of what the drivers of conflict are and some commitment to dealing with it. That's a leadership function, but it's also a function of people within the society's willingness to put those issues on the table and address them. And in too many cases we saw those issues were not acknowledged openly. There wasn't a transparent and open commitment to dealing with the fundamental issues that often were the primary causes of some period of violence and war that preceded some kind of a peace agreement. So people got back to normal and weren't dealing with the fundamental issues. There needs to be some work on the durable political arrangements for handling power, and that's usually done through some kind of a negotiated process. There needs to be good enough governance, not perfect governance. We don't have that here, I would allege. But there needs to be a resilient relationship between the population and their government. There needs to be some way for the government and people to work together towards common ends. There need to be economic fairness and opportunity. This does not mean absolute changes in the GDP or growth or joblessness or any of that. People need to have a sense that the playing field is relatively level. So it's about my group is, the deck is not stacked against my group. So I can, if I'm a young person trying to get into the, get a job and all of that, there's not a sense that things are so stacked against me that I'm just never going to get ahead. And that's based on group identity, however defined, that's there. And then social cohesion, which is the area where I think a lot of us probably feel the most comfort, and a lot of our programming is based on building social cohesion, and that definitely is something that needs attention. So working with those 6 domains, and being fascinated as we have been, most of this work was done by Diana Chigas, my colleague who's now at the full-time at Tufts, but was the co-director of the Reflecting on Peace Practice project for 13 years with me. We've been fascinated by systems thinking. So we discovered a systems thinking tool that puts all of those 6 domains together, which results in, this is called a factor tree, where the high-level goal is the degree and sustainability of progress towards peace, and shows a cascading upward of factors that lead to those 6 categories that I talked about, and then ultimately to that peace. This is a little scary to see all that all at once, and I acknowledge that. One thing I forgot was the global factors that affect everything, which again will be very familiar to people in this room. Horizontal inequalities, pattern of exclusion and inclusion, sense of grievance, and mental models and political culture regarding power, which is a mouthful, but it really has to do with how people treat and think about how power is held and transferred within the society. And those appear at the bottom of the factor tree because they affect all of the factors in the tree. So we're just beginning to use this as a tool in the field, working with groups to say, where have we made progress and where have we not made progress towards peace in our context. And we actually do color coding to try to see, what are the factors in red that really need some attention, what are the factors in blue where there's been some progress, and factors in green that where there might have been real significant progress. That gives a visual mapping of where things stand that then can help people set priorities about what to do about the situation, particularly in situations where we're trying to promote collective impact. So that will become a tool in that process. So you have on your table a flyer that we put together in the last couple of weeks. I read back through a lot of the critiques of the peacebuilding field that have been out there. Some of you may remember that are old enough. 2008-9, Simon Fisher and Lauda Zemina put forward some critiques. I went back and read that. I looked at Althusser's critique in Peaceland. I looked at some of the work that Andy Karl and others have been doing in the Pax Spiral thing, which he'll be talking about a bit later, and looked at, well, what are the critiques that we are making of ourselves? This is that inward-looking thing that Chip was talking about, where we have our own critiques of ourselves, and what are we doing right? What are we not doing? Some of the folks in the systems thinking world talk about our tendency to admire the problem, so that we get greater and greater understanding, deeper and deeper understanding of the problem, rather than moving to solutions. So rather than dwell on that diagram, I'm going to move to what I think we ought to do about it. So this is the rant part of my presentation, where I think there were, at one point there were 12 things I was suggesting about this. I don't remember whether it comes out to that anymore. Little pitch, if you're interested in this mapping of the peacebuilding field, Rob Sigliano and a colleague from Wisconsin are running a session at 4 o'clock this afternoon. It's one of the concurrent sessions. And they said if you're interested and want to come to that session, bring this map with you, because they're going to build on it to further that discussion. So what needs to be done? This is my rant. I'm going to run through them quickly because my time is probably getting short. Peacebuilding needs to connect more fully with the development sector. Some of that has been discussed in the past few days. We've been talking about connecting with the nonviolent section. I'm saying we need to connect with the development actors in the field. The amount of ODA that goes to development is enormous, and the amount of ODA that goes to peacebuilding is tiny. They have the money and resources, they have the infrastructure on the ground, they often are in place for the long term, and many of the problems that we consider structural violence or structural conflict have to do with development issues. So there should be a natural partnership with development actors in the field. But we are so siloed, we rarely work with them, with the exception of those organizations that we call multi-mandate, the CARES, the Catholic Relief Services, organizations like that that work across all of those domains tend to do that. Polly, our new executive director, comes out of the development and the humanitarian field, and CDA works with those people quite a lot. So we see the connections that need to be there. I'm saying that as a peacebuilding field, we need to get out of our specialty area of peacebuilding and really connect with the development actors a lot more. If nothing else, because they've got the money. I mean, basic, okay? We keep hearing this mantra that conflict is constantly changing and everything is shifting and we have to adapt and pay attention and all of that. To a certain extent, that's true, and I am a total proponent of adaptive management. On the other hand, through the studies that I just mentioned, the cumulative impact cases, we found that the underlying drivers of conflict are persistent, long-term, and resilient. They don't change. The stuff that we talk about is what I call the noise in the system, those political shifts, which group is ascendant, which group is descendant, who's in power now, who's not. The underlying structures of conflict do not change. And those factors get neglected, and there's a part of the conflict map there, the systems map there, you'll see where those long-term issues just get neglected all the time. So we need to pay attention to those longer-term issues and don't get so distracted by what I call the sort of siren call of the immediate and sort of crisis moments. So the issues of justice, equity, participation, access to resources, rule of law, that whole package is in the development sphere. So those are issues that we need to be working on. I think as peace builders, we've always been a little bit cautious about talking about human rights, about justice, about those things, feeling that, well, that's somebody else's job. I think we need to make it our job, because without addressing those issues of justice, we're not going to get there. For that reason, we need to be working with the folks that are doing nonviolent action and the mobilization of populations to make change in their own contexts. So given my background of 20 plus years working on social change and then making a slight shift into peacebuilding, I see those connections and feel them, but we don't make them manifest in the work that we do. Sometimes it's really going to take a social change movement and mobilization to make the changes that are necessary to get to the kinds of durable peace that we're talking about. So we need to be doing that, and there's been a whole discussion, and I'm really delighted in the last few days where that really is moving forward. So this is one place where the discussion about being locally driven and locally based really comes to play, because we can't be about building social change movements in other people's contexts, at least not very explicitly. That has to be a pretty subtle kind of operation. But we can build partnerships with those folks and look at the strategizing that needs to take place, particularly at the end of the, not the end, but in the process when it becomes a negotiation. So, and we can bring those skills to play, and also talk about, well, if you're going to have an uprising in Egypt, what's phase 2? You know, so, or wherever the context is, if there's a big change movement going, how do we help them to strategize about the change processes and what needs to happen out of those? I've already mentioned this one about particularly when we talk about prevention, most of the discussion is about early warning, early response, which I call late warning and late response, and it's dealing with crises, and most of us are not geared up. We don't really have the capacities to deal with crisis moments, for the most part. There's some exceptions to that, but we shouldn't be trying to be the UN or to be some paramilitary organization that comes in to try to prevent some escalating conflict. We need to be dealing with those longer-term prevention, real prevention issues that are upstream and that can prevent those crises from occurring, rather than getting pulled off into these crisis moments. This goes along with what I'm saying about connecting with nonviolent movements. I think there's a whole myth about our neutrality. We're not neutral, and we should be clear about that. I don't think we need to be necessarily wearing it on our sleeve, but with our partners and folks, we need to be transparent about what we believe and why we're there and what we're working for, and not try to put ourselves forward necessarily as a completely neutral group, which is unrealistic anyway. And there's a whole debate about that in the conflict resolution side of our field. One of the other things that we need to be doing, and I think this is reflected in the PAC Spiral group, is we need to be bolder and larger scale. A lot of what we've been doing is in a very innovative and experimental mode, but tends to be really what I call boutique peace building, rather than seeking the kind of scale and level of impact that we really need in order to effect the changes that are required. We need to get over that. There's been a lot said about supporting local leadership for change, and I fully support that, with the caveat that the local context is often extremely complex, and who belongs to whom and who is related to what, and what, you know, where the loyalties lie in the connections is often a complex picture. So just saying, well, we need to support local leadership, it can't stop there. We need to have a much more nuanced understanding of who are the local leaders. So getting over the go-it-alone approaches, some of the analysis you have in front of you has some of the impacts of that. Looking for some achievable medium-term goals where we can come together. It doesn't have to be for some big thing, but for something that's achievable, and build those coalitions of the willing to do that. Some of us have been talking about a sort of missing role, that who can bring people together to form those coalitions and groups. So we need to be experimenting with that. I'm getting the high sign here. I have just a couple more things to say. So we've been working on this collective impact thing under a grant from Humanity United. The recasting of the FSG model has resulted in sort of 5 different things that we need to be doing, which echo their 5, but they're reframed in a kind of way. We'll be posting the framework on CDA website, and there's in the flyer you can see where that is. So we encourage you to look at that framework. If you're involved in some kind of coalition or action group, use it, and we only ask that you let us know what happened. On the other hand, we're also looking for case studies, because we want to study and understand better how those collective action processes work, so that we can then report that back to you and to others about how to build these coalitions and when it works and when it doesn't. So we're looking for those examples. And they can be bad examples too. If something was a complete disaster, people tried to come together and things didn't work so well, there's often those learnings from that kind of process that we're willing to do too. So if you know good examples, let us know. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. And that's a perfect backdrop for this next Ignite round. This is not even an appetizer. This is like the thimbleful of soup that you get when you go to a restaurant between courses, the amuse-bouche. What we're trying to do is to whet your appetite for these amazing initiatives where visionary leaders in our field have tried to bring together different aspects of our community, reaching out to other sectors. We just wanted to let all of you know what's out there so we can try to build cumulative impact for our field. And that's really one of the key messages for today. So I'm going to be ruthless in my timekeeping. So please, it's not rudeness if I cut people off. It's just making sure we're keeping to schedule. We'll follow the order that's listed in your program, which is random. You don't have to look at any meaning and how we've placed the order. So first, I'd like to welcome Harriette Lamb and Greg Houston.
Thank you, Melanie. Well, as you can see, I was not born to be a supermodel. I've got lumps and bumps in all the wrong places. But I'm very proud today to be modeling this beautiful, I don't know if you can all see, this beautiful material from a campaign in DRC Congo, where 60 women's groups came together under one campaign banner, Rien sans les femmes, and walked through the streets of Kinshasa and delivered the largest ever petition to Parliament demanding a change in the laws to help women vote. And in the same way, I'm sure all of you are involved in a multiple of campaign initiatives where we seek to mobilize people. But recently, a group of us, 12 NGOs and networks in the peace-building field, came together and we said, what if we could take that kind of popular campaigning and ignite it to another whole level? Just indeed, as Julia was discussing in that inspiring session this morning. What if, from DC to DRC, from Burundi to Belgium, we could unite behind easy, simple campaign actions that anybody could take in their communities? And what if we worked, all of us together in a coalition, and reached out way beyond this room to bring in not only the development and the humanitarian organizations with the mass memberships, but also the faith groups and the universities and the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides and the private sector? And what if we could bring all of those people together behind those simple, empowering actions that any citizen could take wherever they live? That would together we could help inspire a global grassroots social movement that would help build the public constituency for peace, and where we would be really working together in a coalition so that the total is more than the sum of the parts, and so that politicians would know that there are options beyond bombs and band-aids, and that there is an effective intervention, peace building, that not only works and is cost-effective, but that is backed by a popular grassroots social movement that has the power to help create that change. And so that was the vision behind this group of us getting together that Greg is now going to share a little bit more about.
Thanks, Harriette. I'm a little embarrassed. I think this is from a Macy's Black Friday sale, so it's not quite the same meaning.
I'm sure we can get you a tie made of this.
It's a nice tie. Well, thanks for that. I represent Search for Common Ground, as you'll see, and we were pleased to partner with so many great organizations. I also want to thank the Compton Foundation for their support and the Gallup organization for lending space and some data to this process. You know, over 2 days, we built a cross-section, field-wide commitment to doing communications advocacy in a different way, as Harriette said. And I think it's different because it doesn't duplicate efforts. It presents a unified vision. It is built around a detailed manifesto, and I'm going to share that manifesto in a moment. You've heard little bits and pieces of it over the last few days. You know, here's what I think is exciting. We can only be successful by aligning around a purpose. As we sat and talked over 2 days, that was one of the real key insights. I think we all know that, but it was interesting to talk about it. It's a purpose that changes the way we do work together as a collective to maximize how we do business as a field and how we make ourselves more relevant, right? One thing that came out in our discussions, which I think is just kind of a fun way to think about it, but why don't we start by turning peace building into a word, right? Really simple thing. For some reason, it's not recognized. You get that little red squiggly line under it when you type it into anything in Google or Microsoft. Let's make it a word. Like, that's a really easy thing that we can all get and build around. But in all seriousness, you know, we need an effort that will impact all of us as a group. And if we build this group right, we can maximize the visibility of the field as a whole. We'll have more people buying into our narratives. We'll have more people giving money, which is a good thing. And we'll hold leaders accountable for viewing and taking appropriate steps around our shared principles. You know, the comparison that we used was the environmental movement. Think about how that eventually coalesced and mobilized around the world around a shared vision and set of principles. Now it's our turn. That's what I think really came out of the last 2 days. But the question now is, how do we take it forward? That remains to be seen. It's early days. We had a couple of really deep conversations over that period. And I think we've struck a new way forward, which we'll continue to elaborate throughout the next couple of days. But most importantly, what we realized and what this process will lead to is a new way to popularize our solutions to conflict. So what I'd like to do, just very briefly, unless you'd like to, is just to read a few lines of the manifesto. I've done a lot of talking. Do you want to read the manifesto? Yeah, it's cool. All right, cool. Your peace is my peace. My peace is yours. Violence anywhere threatens peace everywhere. Each of us can be an agent of peace. Together, we can, and we must inspire the human race to live together in solidarity. If we don't, we all lose. We will face resistance. There are those who seek to gain from our divisions. Some even seek to profit from violence. But in fact, we all suffer from it. And too many of us believe violence is inevitable. We believe it is not. It starts with us. It starts now. And we're going to continue to refine that. We think that's a really good start for a manifesto as a collective. What I would like from this room, I think we would all like from this room, is your feedback and your thoughts. I don't know if Jennifer Williams is in this room. Okay. Okay, so she's not here. Her email, she's giving it out without her knowing, but please feel free to be in touch with her, is jwilliams@international-alert.org. She's at International Alert, but she represents all of us. She works for the collective to help build a campaign and move it forward. Harriette and I are also always available, so please continue to engage with us. We'll continue to report out, we'll continue to refine this group and come to a consensus on how we build a path forward.
So just to say, we're really right at the start of this, and we're launching it here today at the Alliance for Peacebuilding conference, who are, of course, one of the members of this group. So we really hope that all of you will get in touch and will help us all together create this much wider, more popular grassroots movement for peace. I'm always personally really inspired by a saying by native Indians in Mexico who say, "Many little raindrops falling in the mountains make the mighty rivers flow." And I always think in the same way, we all need to be those little raindrops, but really coalescing our efforts in that slide that Julia showed this morning, so that we can really build a much more powerful movement together. And so I really hope that you will get in touch, because we're right at the early stages of thinking this through, and we need the input from everybody in this room and way, way beyond. And as you can hear, I'm from sad old Brexit Britain, where we have a saying rooted in bitter experience: you wait all day for a bus, and then 3 buses come along all at once. And in a bit the same way, the peace-building sector as a whole has not, until now, been very good at working together and collaborating behind initiatives. And now suddenly there's a flowering where everybody recognizes that we have to do that. And so you'll see now today a number of different initiatives coming up, and I want to also reassure you our commitment is to see how can we thread together the different initiatives where people have started to do some of that collaborative working together, so that we can make sure we don't end up competing, but actually we really do end up coming behind that one, hopefully, grassroots social movement for peace. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Harriette and Greg. And you might have heard me yesterday at the opening at USIP testing out some of that language. And we really encourage all of you to see if it works in your communities. So next, we have Andrew Tomlinson from Quaker UN office in New York.
Hi, everyone. So we need to work together, but the world is changing around us quite rapidly. So what I want to spend a moment or two thinking about is, given this increase in complexity, what implications are that? What new forms of collaboration and collective action can we be looking at? What new tools can we be using to do that? So the complexity, the report you're beginning to hear about from the World Bank and the UN on prevention and the role of development, one of the little things they came up with was that in 1950, the number of armed groups involved in a civil war was about 8. By 2014, the number of armed groups involved in Syria was over 2,000. So just to give you a sort of a little sense, that growing complexity of where peace building is done. We also have growing complexity in the policy environment. So now we have to talk, as we heard, to development groups. We have to talk to humanitarian actors. We have to talk to people involved in disaster relief. We have to talk to the hard edge of peace and security as well. Suddenly, there is a need for a peace-building voice in all of these different areas. And then, as well as this growing complexity, there is a growing rapidity of change. This environment is changing a lot all around us, and that has implications. It's the case now, largely in my experience, working in a particular policy environment at the UN, is the context is now always partly unknown. We're always feeling our way through a shifting fog. If you're somebody who needs to map out everything precisely, you have a problem, because you're never going to get out of the scoping phase now, because the environment just keeps on changing on you. No individual person or no individual organization actually has the complete picture, let alone all of the answers. And so there's a real premium on engaging different perspectives and maximizing exploration and feedback, and a real need for flexibility. What works today simply may not work tomorrow. So a couple of examples then. So firstly, the idea of new forms of collective action. Now, as you know, many of folks at this conference were involved in the whole process around getting the peace issues within the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. That was a 5-year process, and it was amazingly complicated. Even the basic critical path of what the process was by which decisions were being made was amazingly unclear from month to month. And so there was a need to be incredibly nimble. And what we found is there were a series of ad hoc, sort of good enough partnerships being formed among civil society, government delegates, UN officials, according to the need of the moment. There's a constant need to communicate and learn to shift scale. So for some tasks, you needed a small focus group pushing in one way. Other places, we need to build a big umbrella and say, even though we got people talking from disarmament to local level justice, how do we pull all this together to deliver a single message? Not only forms, but also tools. And certainly for us, reflective practice in a collective setting is incredibly important. We're now into the 5th year of an annual meeting we have to as a small group of peace-building leaders and heads of agency or policy, with a deliberately open-ended agenda for 2 or 3 days, with topics emerging from group exploration to create a supportive space where hopefully people are coming out with ideas at the end of it that they didn't walk into the door with. To create then group ownership of ideas and processes. One of the outcomes from this group was what a number of you have seen, and there's a bunch of copies out outside, of the statement from peacebuilding organizations for the International Day of Peace, which went out to every diplomatic delegation arriving in New York for the UN General Assembly this year, and was signed by 134 peacebuilding organizations, including many of you all. So thank you. So simply then, to summarize, an increasingly complex and changing environment calls for flexible, light, and ad hoc collaborations, reflective practice, eclectic partnerships, and in the end, and fundamentally, a high tolerance for uncertainty and change. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Next, we have Marie Dennis, Pax Christi International, and a member of AFP's board.
Thank you, Melanie, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. For the past 1,300 years, Catholic teaching on war and peace, as articulated in the Just War framework, has had a significant impact on the public, on political decision makers, and on international humanitarian law. The intention was to deter war, but too often the reality was exactly the opposite, with disastrous consequences, including, for example, the Crusades. In the last century, that teaching has begun to shift, giving more attention to the potential effectiveness of nonviolent alternatives, as civil resistance campaigns around the world were amazingly successful. But the just war theory stayed on center stage in church teaching, and very few of the 1.2 billion Catholics in the world learned anything about the effectiveness of nonviolent strategies in conflict transformation and social change, or about the broader understanding of nonviolence as a spirituality and a way of life, which is actually essential to our faith tradition. Yet the institutional church has at times been a powerful advocate for nonviolent civil resistance, for nonviolent conflict, as during the People Power Revolution in the Philippines or the nonviolent revolution in Poland. Last year, in April, 85 people from around the world gathered in Rome for what has been called a landmark conference on nonviolence and just peace, co-sponsored by the Vatican and Pax Christi International, which was a pretty unlikely partnership. Participants came together to imagine a new framework for Catholic teaching on war and peace that could contribute to the development and appreciation of nonviolent tools for conflict transformation. Central to our conversation were the voices of people promoting nonviolent strategies in the midst of horrific violence, from Iraq, Sri Lanka, Colombia, South Sudan, the DR Congo, Mexico, Afghanistan, Palestine, El Salvador, the Philippines, Northern Ireland, Lebanon, Burundi, Guatemala, Uganda, South Africa, and more. Their testimony about the urgent need to end war and the potential effectiveness of nonviolent ways to do so was extremely powerful. In a formal statement delivered to Pope Francis, the conference urged the Church to promote nonviolence, including nonviolent conflict transformation, using every tool at the disposal of the Church throughout the world, and to adopt a new nonviolent framework for Church teaching about war and peace. The Catholic Church has a well-developed network of universities, seminaries, religious communities, parishes, publications, media outlets, and has a diplomatic presence in almost every country and at all of the multinational organizations. We think that could make a tremendous contribution to the development and acceptance of nonviolent approaches to a more peaceful world. Our goal is to move the significant institutional capacity of the Church to educate and advocate for significant investment in nonviolent strategies to transform conflict, protect threatened populations, and promote just peace. In asking the Church to adopt a new moral framework based on nonviolent practice for its teaching on war and peace, We said that too often the just war theory has been used to endorse rather than to prevent or limit war, and that suggesting that a just war is possible actually undermines the moral imperative to develop tools and capacity for the nonviolent transformation of conflict. Essential ethical criteria to guide political decision makers are clearly ensconced in international humanitarian law and could be included in an ethical framework not built around the concept of just war. In response to our appeal, Pope Francis, on whose fairly significant global credibility we are obviously building this campaign, wrote his World Day of Peace message on nonviolence, a style of politics for peace. In the past 2 years, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative that grew out of the Rome Conference has engaged in a very serious conversation with the Vatican and with the local church around the world, including in many war zones, about the breadth and potential of nonviolent strategies to further sustaining peace. An ambitious international roundtable process involving theologians, peace practitioners, experts in nonviolent conflict, activists, and academics is well underway. We believe this process will bear fruit in more fully developed Catholic teaching, possibly an encyclical, on the theology and spirituality of nonviolence, but also on nonviolent strategies toward just peace. We are grateful to all of you for your clear, strong examples of the power and effectiveness of nonviolent strategies, for your deep understanding of peacebuilding. We are extremely interested in the conversation about sustaining peace, SDG 16, and related public policy proposals that we hope the Church will support. As a 70-year-old Catholic peace movement with 120 member organizations on 5 continents, we are really tired of being told that only military action will work, whatever threat or crisis is on the horizon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. Next, Julia Roy, President of Partners Global.
So this looks familiar because we started our day talking about narratives for peace, and I wanted to just follow up with you to let you know some of the actions behind what we're doing, because it wasn't by accident that we had Peter and Ina here with us. There was some real strategy behind building new partnerships with their field. So go ahead. Oh, do I have it? Sorry. There we go. So we kind of were thinking with the Alliance for Peacebuilding about this concept of creating a platform for peace builders and our allies to really align together around this shift in what we see happening in the world. And it was a little bit like I was saying, that we can't build this capacity amongst ourselves fast enough and with enough depth to be able to be interfacing with these public narratives. And so really what we wanted to do, and I think many of us have come to this idea about a brand, about a campaign, about kind of shifting narratives. And so you're hearing about some kind of parallel track activities that we're really seeing kind of coming together now. And it's really exciting to be here with our colleagues and having these conversations. But the way that we really kind of mapped out our Narratives for Peace initiative was to think about this place that served as a reference point for these partnerships. Again, we want to think about maybe rebranding peace so that more people, as our colleagues were saying from Search and International Alert, can see themselves there, can find them there, and that eventually we want to be building this collective storytelling engine to amplify our voices and really help to drive collective action. What I want to highlight to you, though, is how much time it takes this partnership approach, because we have to go to these other industries, find them where they are, and start communicating that with them in new ways. So I'm going to show you a 2-minute video about one thing that we did in New York last May.
It was so interesting to bring together such a diverse group of people who still have in common this shared passion about peace and in learning more and being open to each other's ideas.
It's good to be here because it really took me out of my own little bubble. I love hearing everyone's point of view on peace means for them, and it's also kind of prompted me to think of what it means for me too.
If you look at brands, if you look at technology companies, can they play a role in bringing a message of peace to people and also making them a part of it?
What technology has done is that it's fundamentally changed the way we define that concept of community. I won't relate to someone who comes from the same country as I am if they don't have the same values as I do.
Socioeconomic inequality is a complete and across the board uniter of everyone's concerns.
Any movement that's going to really take hold is going to be authentic, will start organically, probably one-to-one, and spread from there like any great movement has.
If we can really try to walk in each other's shoes and experience what the other challenges are, perhaps we can find a common ground that will get us on a step to peace.
Today I feel particularly inspired to be a peace builder through my work of bringing together unlikely bedfellows.
It's important to look at who the youth are in the world and where the biggest populations of people are. So bringing them into the conversation and figuring out what messages can penetrate them, I think will be the sustainable answer to the future of peace in the world.
I feel so privileged to have been here and to have gotten out of that technical, political conversation in Washington into something that felt much more human and connected. So thank you so much to Thomas.
I leave hopeful that this wonderful group of people that we've been able to bring together really find ways to collaborate going forward. It was a fantastic evening.
So, I wanted to bring these voices into the room. This was a kind of a creative brain trust that we brought together in New York, and it was underwritten by Tom's, the shoe company, that they were really interested in also convening this conversation with us. And it happened around New York Creative Week when all of their industry was coming together to give out a golden pencil for the best in design and marketing. And we were able to kind of bring a really diverse group of people in the room to plant the seed of this idea of what their industry could potentially do for working for peace. A little bit what Peter said in the end is like, wow, we really need you guys too. They really are appreciative of this outreach for a partnership approach. And so where that's led us to a certain extent is testing out some things, actually. And so the next piece that I'm putting up here, and many of you know that, and maybe could we scroll down just a little bit? This was something that we did with regards to this kind of collective kind of storytelling engine. Is around the International Day of Peace, we created this content aggregation site with one of the colleagues that came out of, they just said, well, listen, I've got kind of a marketing technique that I do with colleagues, and we started reaching out to many of you saying, could you feed us some of your best content? And let's see if we can try and get as many eyes on this content as possible, because we're kind of realizing in this kind of marketing game, it's all about clicks. And can we demonstrate that there's an audience for this kind of content? We hit our marks with regards to 10,000 a week and people clicking on it and the number of shares. It peaked around International Day of Peace. We're kind of evaluating, like, okay, how did that go? And is the right place maybe to be more Upworthy or News Deeply or some others? But the point is it's really, again, about our collective action, being in partnership with another field, which then I think allows us to also reach out to other fields and other brands. So there's so much more to say about this. I wanted to just give you a taste of the experimentation that we're doing and invite a lot more conversations about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Next, Andy Karl from the University of Edinburgh School of Law, and now conceptualizing the idea of Pax Spiral.
Thank you very much. I'm technologically challenged, so I'm going to try and look at two screens at once. Yes, I think we are at a moment where really great minds, clearly, there's a lot of convergence of thinking, and it's very exciting, and it's really nice to be in this little rapid series of conversations, which is really underscoring that. You've heard that, my name's Andy Karl. For my career, like Peter's, a little bit behind Peter, maybe a little bit ahead of Peter in other ways. I also have been leading organizations in the UK working on peace building, and I recently stepped out of the chair of being an executive director, and for me that's been a really interesting moment of personal development. But it also was a moment when I came to realize kind of some of the things that I was carrying that I used to carry that I'm no longer carrying. And those in particular were things like the needs and interests of my own NGO, and how much I'd come to kind of see the world through the eyes of my own NGO. And now I have a little bit of a different vantage point and on myself, on Conciliation Resources, and on our field. And we want to share with you. I want to share with you this. I really like Julius used this phrase about having an audacious proposal. So this was an invitation. Last year, some of you might have noticed the MacArthur Foundation issued an audacious offer, saying if you have a big idea, maybe that would address one of the world's problems, we'll give you $100 million and to address it. And in Britain, that seemed like a very American proposal. But I also thought, and as a number of people think, big idea. Well, we believe in ending war. Why don't we put something together? And so that's where this thing comes from. The name, PAX, as we've heard, is a well-established name. The name Spiral is coming up as more of a symbol which appears throughout, obviously, in human art all over the world in every civilization, and has done so since Paleolithic times. And it's at least in part inspired by the hurricanes that keep on sweeping across the Atlantic and the Caribbean. And they just kind of remind us of how a massive energy system self-organizes into a complex spiral, and with enormous destructive power. This is just a nice quote from Meg Wheatley, which I thought resonated a lot. She wrote it back in the 90s. We live in a time of great stirring of storms, both natural and human-made. Disruptive elements seem to be afoot, gathering strength in air masses that spiral over oceans or in the decisions that swirl through the halls of power. The other side of it, of course, is that the symbol also represents dynamic, organized creation. And this particular logo comes from an American black arts movement from the 70s that I saw recently at the Tate in London. So I like how the word symbolizes and holds out the possibility of working with these forces of change. So, as we've been hearing for the last few days, ending the scourge of war, are we getting any closer? It doesn't look like that from here. And we've been hearing, again, all these different... I thought it was really interesting that when they said the stats that matter are the stats that are the good news, but the stats that we focus on are the stats of the bad news, that 1.5 billion people living in fragile states or so-called fragile states, and the 65 million people displaced in their homes. And this is a quote from this prevention study from the World Bank and the UN, and it underscores that the world is now in the biggest arms race since the end of the Cold War. And according to the ICRC, much like what Andrew just said, there are more armed non-state groups were formed worldwide in the last 6 years than in the previous 60. So we're not winning the peace. But do we as a community, as a field, as a movement, whatever we are, do we still believe that we can? And why do we believe that? And what is it that's getting in our way? As I have done, I kind of invite you to kind of put yourself in my shoes a bit, or take a minute to step outside your own role and think about that context that you know very best, and look across the whole of it. And I would expect that there are many, many organizations and many people working to prevent further violence and doing really innovative work every day. But do all these organizations in your context together have their own organizing dynamics of interorganizational, interdependent relationships? The question we're asking is, what are the factors that keep getting in the way of this living system having more individual and more collective and more cumulative impacts? Because I think ours is a network dominated by our own organizational interests and needs. So PAX Spiral, it's a call to experiment with new ways of working. It's not a new organization. And this is not an attempt to coordinate what cannot be coordinated to deliver as one, as the UN set out to do, but it is about supporting leadership and about helping to change the way we practice our relationships. The idea is to help improve communications, mutual understanding, to enable more processes of shared inquiry, leading to a greater alignment, we've been hearing that today, and greater synergies, and work that makes more of a difference in people's lives. These are some of the organizations that have been kind of involved in kind of cooking the thinking, and they'll be all familiar to you, and some of the individuals who've been involved. It's been very much an open circle and an open conversation, or it was after we made the first pitch to MacArthur, which we didn't make. I think the part of it, we're thinking about the challenge of managing the risks and interests that we bring with us. Also, you know, when we embark on this exploring, we think we have something of value to offer, but if we can be really clear about these roles, and if we can manage our own interests and the needs and the risks that we bring with us, and we can reach an understanding which we can honor. So our rationale is that diverse organizations, local, international, broadly share the aspiration of transforming conflict systems and the security and the development and the reconciliation that could follow, but our separate efforts are affected by the violence that we've set out to address, and that they too fall short of their potentials of adding up and having a whole of conflict-wide impacts that serve the urgent needs of the people most affected. So we think that in order to make such a system function in a healthier and more effective ways, it needs to find ways to connect with itself.
Andy?
Running out of time.
So I feel, how can we end the scourge of war in 7 minutes? So I'm feeling very guilty.
Okay.
We'll need to wrap up.
Okay. I'll race through we wrestled with a number of different problems that we're trying to be clear on what are those problems we're trying to address. And these are some of them, that there's not enough open information or opportunities for reflection between the many groups and leaders working on the conflict for them to have a shared sense of what's most important. The economies for our peace building are strained, and the legal space for our civil society to challenge incumbent interests are full of dangers and risks. Interventions struggle with quality and to have systemic influence. I mean, I think Peter touched upon a number of these in his presentation. And there's a lack of trusted relations between different practitioners. And ultimately, there's no real unity of purpose. We went on to elaborate more. I'll just flick the slides on that, because there's causes behind those factors. And then behind those causal factors, we went on to look at additional ones. And as I said, it's really impossible to do that in just a few minutes. Okay, let me just kind of come to a final bit, which is that, just to be clear, this is something that John Paul Lederach had given us some feedback on about this proposition, and he said, so it's not about building a platform. He says, forget consensus, it's overrated. We've got to think small, we've got to think plural, we've got to think fluid, and think experimental. And so different aspects of this idea would be that we could have small autonomous teams who could help shift practices of relationships. Autonomous in the sense that they wouldn't be a command and control from a central hub, that they wouldn't have a stake, they wouldn't be implementers themselves in the context. So there's more to say, but essentially the argument is why think about this? Why think about working differently? Starting with the fact that because the changes are urgently needed and we have to hold on to that sense of urgency. And secondly, because failing well for us is really not good enough anymore, and also because we can realize more of our potential. So it's a little bit more about reflecting on how the teams would actually work. And a kind of a final quote, then again from Margaret Wheatley, who I've been doing a lot of reading from. And this is one of those challenges, and I think there's a number of those things. I really like the idea that there's no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about. And I think that is very much what we've been doing for the last few days, is discovering a number of things that we all really care about. And this is one of those challenges. So I know that was a bit quick, a bit of rush through, but you can see there's been a lot of thinking. This is also, like a lot of other people have said, an open invitation. Our next stage from this is to see where there might be entry points to take some of the thinking and have these discussions and co-create it locally in a context. So if you have ideas or this resonates with places you work, please contact me or us, and we'd like to take it forward in that way. So thank you very much. Sorry it was a bit long.
Happy to post the slides on AFP website. That's true for all of you, so that people can really dig in.
Yeah,
thank you, Andy.
Thank you. Sorry it was short.
Todd Shuster, the Vitas Creative Management, talking about Peace Studio.
Thank you so much, Melanie. I'm Todd Shuster. I'm managing partner of Avitas Creative Management, and we are a literary agency. So we work with authors primarily who are writing fiction and nonfiction books and also helping get those books published and then taking them to film and television if the stories they're telling are appropriate in those contexts. And it's so exciting to just stand in front of all of you doing this amazing work as peace builders and peacemakers and hoping, as much as one can hope, that we can bring our capacity in the private sector as storytellers to help you, broadcast your message as widely and as successfully as possible. The Peace Studio came to be because about a year and a half ago, I attended the Gandhi King Conference in Memphis and heard a client of ours named Maya Satoru Ing speak about her work. And she's just wonderful. And listening to her talk, at the end of her speech, she said, each one of you should think about the one step that you can take in your life to help the world be a more peaceful place. And initially when I heard her say that, I thought, she's talking to all those people out in the audience. I hope they heed her counsel. But then I thought about it more, and I thought maybe there's something that we could do as storytellers and as people who are tasked over and over again to find content that will actually resonate with the public. And I was saying to Melanie and also to Julia that it's really hard work because we don't only have to find great content, but we have to convince publishers that folks out in the world will actually buy these books because they have to plunk down $30 for a hardcover. Or if it's a film, these days you have to pay $20 to go to a Cineplex and watch a film. So how can we find those stories that will resonate that deeply and that powerfully? So the goal of the Peace Studio is to do exactly that, and we're seeing it in sort of three tranches. We want to be educators, so we want to find curricula that will really resonate in classrooms worldwide. We want to find content, so we want to be creators of content. And then we also want to help convene. And in listening to some of the amazing presentations just before me, and the invitation to kind of find brokers, we want to be a broker. We want to help existing organizations come together across these purposes and find the resources and the stories that really will help coalesce not only the people in this room and all the great work that you are all doing, but also connect that to the public in really interesting and powerful ways. I want to end because in 55 seconds, it's 1 o'clock, and you're all eager to go to lunch. But think of the Peace Studio as a resource for storytelling, creativity, education, and convening. And we are going to help you do just what you all talked about this morning. We're going to help you find the resources, a lot of money, a lot of storytelling, and messaging so that you can rebrand the peace movement. I know we can do it, and I'm really proud to be here in front of all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. So now that we've ended the scourge of war, changed 2 millennia of Catholic teaching about war and peace, we are going to talk about how to reduce violence in the U.S. Madeline Rose from Mercy Corps, you have our final Ignite talk today.
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, everyone. I realize that we are over time, so I will be very fast. It's also hard to come after all these globally focused movement talks to talk about the narrow, not that fun U.S. Political environment right now. But we are currently working on a campaign urging the U.S. government to do for violence what 16 years ago we did for HIV/AIDS. Now, if you worked on the HIV/AIDS movement, be patient with me. I promise we're not stealing the thunder. But think about that statement. We want the U.S. government to do for violence what we did for HIV/AIDS. In the 1990s, when the HIV/AIDS global crisis was hitting an apex, there was about 1 million people a year dying due to the preventable disease of HIV/AIDS. When President Bush became president of the United States, he and Condoleezza Rice sat in a room and thought about what, the various national security priority initiatives that they were going to do outside of the domains of the hard security, peace, and security. Tackling the HIV/AIDS crisis, floated up to the top as one of the #1 priorities President Bush was going to choose to work on in the world. What they facilitated was a process where they basically brought in all of their relevant agencies, from the CDC to USAID, threw up a map of the world, and said, show me where the highest prevalence rates of HIV/AIDS are, and that peppered out a map of the world with about 20 countries that came up in red, where they're the highest prevalence rates. We are urging that the United States needs to go through that same process to tackle the problem set of violence. And we are currently working with a very strong coalition of bipartisan, bicameral members of Congress who are ready to introduce legislation to do that. It is called the Global Violence Reduction and Root Causes of Conflict Act. It is a piece of legislation that would create, very similar to PEPFAR, very similar to the Millennium Challenge Corporation, this large interagency effort to reform how the US government seeks to tackle violence as a development challenge, so kind of bringing it outside of the domains of security, focusing in 10 pilot countries. So, you know, for those who follow development more closely, we've had since PEPFAR the President's Malaria Initiative, we've had Feed the Future, all of which have had a bucket of 15 to 20 priority countries. We think for violence and conflict, 20 would be difficult. It's a kind of arbitrary process, how we got to the number, but so we are advocating for a 10-country pilot focus to go forth and try and tackle violence head-on and better address the root causes of conflict. This has been an effort of a lot of groups in this room, strongly including the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And again, since we're over time, I'm not going to say most of what I plan to say, but we really do have this political, you know, I think actually 2 years ago at this conference, a lot of us sat in this room and we said, this is our industry's moment. Like, violence and violent conflict is on the forefront of the World Bank and IMF. It is on the forefront of the United Nations that, you know, the United Nations has tried over and over again for the last 30 years to create a platform around better addressing the root causes, and we've never gotten there. But now we have. We have Sustainable Development Goal 16, which has quantitative indicators for measuring reductions on drivers, which we've never had before. We have RCTs that demonstrate that we can prove that we've reduced violence through interventions. We have the quantitative numbers, and we have the bad statistics, right? So the bad statistics is what is going to mobilize politicians. That the WHO says 1.3 million people a year are dying due to preventable violence, which is higher than what HIV/AIDS was. We have the Institute for Economics and Peace, who said that the cost of violence containment right now is $14.3 trillion a year, which is 13% of GDP going just to containment. And several other statistics that really frustrate politicians. And we've created a political environment where they recognize that we need to do something different. And we have worked for, you know, over a year and a half to kind of build a proposal of what that different is. I think the long view for this broader community is that, you know, of course, the United States governance initiative alone is not going to at all satisfy the global demands and the many efforts that need to be done at all these levels of global governance to address the challenges we talk about here as a community. But the US government does remain the largest foreign assistance funder in the world, and we are hoping that this bill will help catalyze a process around investments and indicators and strategies that align with Sustainable Development Goal 16. So this is a long tunnel effort for us to say, how do we start moving the US government and other big bilateral donors in the trajectory of laying the foundation for achieving SDG 16 without actually telling them that what they're doing is achieving SDG 16, because they don't really care about that. So yeah, we would love your support. I mean, so many of these groups, you know, we really have been doing the best that we can here in DC to put this bill together, but as it moves forward, really seek the support and partnership of the broader community and how we can globalize and make sure that the US effort is most aligned with global best practice.
Thank you so much, Madeline. So thank you to all of our speakers, to all of you. I want to recognize Darnell Rodriguez-Torres, who is the head of the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, GPAC, an international network of civil society organizations around the world. And just to acknowledge the work you're doing of linking these networks for the kind of cumulative impact we've talked about today. AFP is part of the North American region of GPAC, so you're all automatically members of GPAC, but I wanted to acknowledge you, Darnell, and to say thank you. So we're moving now. Moving into lunch, it's out here. We're going to go to our panels at 2 o'clock. If you're a speaker, we have extra flash drives if you need to upload anything. The AFP business meeting for all members will actually be fun and talk, not all business, in the Vista room. Reminder to fill out your Menti if you haven't already, that Julia talked about.